Morning, everybody. How we doing today? It's Monday. Had a great weekend in the cities doing my gigs. Both gigs are fantastic and fun. Seeing progress just in terms of the numbers and people coming out. Just want to get back to that pre-pandemic atmosphere where people weren't, nervous to be out. But we're getting there, Judging by the Minneapolis St. Paul airport yesterday, which I drove by, there must have been 20 planes taking off in a 10-minute stretch driving by it. So it looks like we're getting back to more of a normal, whatever that is anymore. But I'm ready to be done with the fear-mongering of the pandemic, and it's not, I'm not saying anything isn't legitimate. It's just, it's exhausting to always be living in those conditions of fear, and it makes you kind of recognize what people who live during a war-torn nation or during those type of stressors, how they must have to live with those conditions. It must be exhausting, and I think you get numb to it after a certain point. Even people going through the Battle of Britain, which was my mom and my grandma and grandpa, who I lost my grandparents a long time ago. But my mom's memories are when she was very young, before she went to Canada. But still, I remember seeing my grandma, who was always milk and cookies, Sir Daniel with a gift card and a $10 bill kind of thing. The change in her demeanor when someone mentioned the war. It wasn't like something she wanted to reminisce about, talk about it. A pale pall would just come across her face, and it was, it left a mark on me as a young kid. To see grandma, who's all cinnamon spice, suddenly look like a horror show, and just the palpable look of fear, and a memory she didn't want to relive. Her husband, my grandpa Charlie, was a surveyor during the war, and they say he saw some action, although there's some who debate that. I'm not really sure, but he certainly was surveying in Europe in the theater, and then he came back to Canada and helped survey north of the Great Lakes for some highway construction. Developed an alcohol problem and haunted him the rest of his life. The conditions that we can go through as humans and the ways we find to get through. For me, this channel has been my addiction. It's been my release, my outlet to still communicate with my human brethren. And I've found a great community of people. Just know that I really love and appreciate so many of you guys. The dialogue, the conversations, the insight, the feedback, the occasional critique. I'm not above or beyond that. Certainly I'm not a spiritual leader and unable to be criticized. I try to always speak from the heart, but the pandemic's really taken a toll on so many people, and you see addictions and domestic violence and addiction, all suicide, all these things have been high. And it's just time, my human brethren, we can get back into a better place and once again take to the skies and the rails and the roads and mingle among each other. And I'm happy to be back working. I've said it before, and I just love doing what I do. And those who are curious about my DJ sets, I'm going to try to look into how to do a live stream. I'm not sure how that works with, if I put music on YouTube, it gets taken down. Facebook gets taken down. So I'm not exactly sure the details. I guess someone told me that a live stream, it just gets played and then it disappears and it's gone. I don't really know these things, but it might be a fun thing to be able to do. It would be hard for me to do by myself because I'm already really engaged in what I'm doing, and unless I can just press start and let it go. But anybody has any good insight on that, how to live stream and what the required setup would be? Can I have a program on my laptop that I'm using that just runs into my mixer and picks up everything I'm playing? I'm not sure. Will it get the vinyl stuff? Like, it probably has to come out of my mixer into the back end of the laptop, possibly. I'm not really sure. Do I need a separate laptop for it? I don't know. But anyway, today we're going to talk about something near and dear to my heart, And it's another one of those things that a lot of today's collectors kind of overlook and sneer at some. And it's also something that Prestige Records does better than Blue Note Records. And that's not something you're going to say very often. The integrity of Blue Note, the lack of the con game, the records being repackaged and greatest hits and Christmas. Like, Prestige was ruthless. They repackaged the same music 5 different ways a Sunday. Like, they didn't give no shits. Blue Note was never into that kind of deception. And when Alfred and Frank ran the label, there was no greatest hits, there's no collections, there's no Christmas records, just record after record after record of new, fresh music with great artwork. So Prestige was definitely something that was a tier below Blue Note in some aspects. Not to say they didn't do some things better. And one of the things they really do better is they hire and bring into the camp a lot more of the old school legends than Blue Note does. And you see in the 10-inch era Blue Note dabbling with some earlier players, and they haven't really quite established their sound necessarily. And even in the early 1500s, there's kind of still some stabs in the dark, but by 1536, 1540, Blue Note's kind of establishing what their sound's going to be, that hard, aggressive, hard bop sound that just rules jazz in 57, 58, 59. And Prestige never really defines a Prestige sound, as it were. You could maybe claim that the soul jazz sound and the organ jazz sound of the 60s was very Prestige dominated, and there's some validity in that argument. But Blue Note was doing a lot of soul jazz and boogaloo, which was kind of the same thing in some ways. A lot of organ jazz, guitar jazz. A lot of Blue Note Cool, as I was talking about in the Lou Donaldson episode, was a precursor to and became part of the soul jazz movement. Even guys like Stanley Turrentine worked with Shirley Scott and made great soul jazz records, both at Blue Note and Prestige. But Prestige opened up their doors to a lot of the earlier cats that were no longer finding work in the big bands, which were pretty much all broken up by this time. The economics of running a big band just didn't even work for even the Count Basies and the Duke Ellingtons. You know, even Benny Goodman had to come off the road at one point. It's a different era in jazz, different economics, and there's new sounds coming out that are changing the direction. And of course, R&B and rock and roll, the early sounds of that are coming and changing the landscape and changing the consumer's interests on a very large scale. So jazz is now kind of struggling to find its new direction, which it never really does. It just loses more and more traction and more of its audience and more of its part in the marketplace, to the point by 1960 it's less than 1%, if I remember. And the numbers only get smaller. And I would argue today that we probably sell as much jazz vinyl now as we did in the 50s and 60s, potentially. And a lot of that secondhand used jazz market is very expansive. There's a lot of it. A lot of people are buying used jazz records that don't show up in the consumer numbers. So I think jazz vinyl is as popular now as it's been probably since the 40s. And of course, by the 30s into the 40s, jazz was selling millions of records. During the swing era, into the war years, jazz was the dominating sound of America. But that definitely changes into the 50s and the 60s. And so jazz is doing well again in terms of some of the reissue programs and what's happening. Like I said, that used vintage market, a lot of great stuff's being sold in these auctions. Carolina Soul, Funky Sounds, those guys on eBay get great top dollar for a lot of great records. Once a month they have a jazz auction, both of them, and they're both high-end price point wise, not because of what they set the prices at, but because of the number of followers those auctions have. So I've seen people pay 3 times for a record what they could buy. Sorry, my phone ran out of memory there. I've seen people at those auctions on eBay, those big sites, pay 2-3 times what you could buy the same record for at Discogs at that same moment. People just get carried away in the moment, and I know myself, even sometimes when you're buying from one seller, you'll pay a few extra bucks because it offsets it with the shipping. To buy the same record elsewhere, you have to pay shipping additionally. But still, buying a $25 record for $75, there's no savings there anywhere. And I see it happen all the time. And I've caught myself a few times about to bid $66 on something. Looked on Discogs and found one for $18. I'm like, yeah, I'm not going to bid on that. So you gotta be careful on those big auction houses. They have some great stuff, some stuff you ain't gonna find listed. Buy it now anywhere, but the prices will really. If a seller has 5,000 followers, they all got that same email alerting them, and most people are looking for a lot of the same things. Tommy Flanagan overseas, 500 people are gonna be like, oh shoot, I'm gonna take a bid on that, and sometimes you'll know within the last 24 hours that this is going to go way beyond where I'm going to spend for sure. Other times you can get fooled. There's been times I'm like, oh man, 2 minutes ago I'm going to win this shit, and then it still jumps up to $400 in the last 30 seconds. You're like, ah. But that's the pain and the pleasure of collecting. And the internet's a bit of a different beast. You know, in person you don't have to really deal with that same stuff. But so a lot of today's collectors kind of ignore prestige Moodsville. And what a mistake. It's one of the great side labels that Bob Weinstock at Prestige issues. And he doesn't put them on the main 7,000 sequence. They do a separate sequence for a lot of these early cats that he's signing up. And there's a Swingsville, which we'll talk about in a coming episode, and there's Moodsville, which we're going to talk about today. And Moodsville houses some of the greats of the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, recording for Bob Weinstock at Prestige in the late 50s and early 60s. And some of these guys don't get a lot of records outside of the big bands they were once in. So a lot of these guys have a couple records to their name as a leader, and they're on Bob Weinstock's Moodsville or Swingsville label, which, of course, that's an impressive thing in and of itself. And Weinstock does deserve some credit here. Let's be clear, I don't think there was ever any noble intent on Bob Weinstock's behalf to say, I want to preserve the legacy of these jazz greats. I don't think he was ever on Norman Granz about it, where he thought, this is high art, I'm sure he loved and respected the music to some degree. They all had to on some level. Although I've heard like Herman Lubinsky at Savoy was pretty impartial to a lot of the music he was recording and treated them like crap. Weinstock's reputation is definitely better than Lubinsky or the Chess Brothers, but Weinstock was still a bit of a snake, still a bit of a hustler, and I don't think there was any kind of high moral ground or precedent being set by him recording these guys. I thought he probably figured he could make a few bucks. These guys weren't being recorded. I could probably sign them for cheap, and there's probably some audience out there that remembers these guys. And that being said, he ends up recording some of the best small jazz settings for a lot of these guys' career, but also for you as a consumer to digest. The Swingsville stuff, as it sounds, is going to be more up-tempo. It's not swing music, generally speaking, though. It's guys from the swing era recording in small groups, doing kind of modern interpretations of songs. It's very seldom is it a swing setting, like a swing band with a big. It's not that. Generally speaking, Swingville's not that. Moodsville is more uniformly going to be ballads and the beautiful side of jazz, the elegant, discreet, subtle artistry of playing a ballad. Not all players can do it. Not all players have the patience, the space, the soothing calmness to effortlessly be minimal and to play to the piece and to the composition an emotional take that's compelling. And the great balladeers can, with one note, suck you in. I love Moodsville. All in all, there's like 39 titles. And when we get into the 30s, some of it's collections of stuff from earlier Moodsville, from other artists, from The great songwriters of the American Songbook will compile tracks from those guys from the Prestige stuff. So some of the mid-30s titles you don't need to have as much because the stuff's out there in other formats. But really, Moodsville number 1 through 30 is all outstanding stuff. And let's just dive right in. Red Garland. And you'll see Weinstock uses some of the same guys repeatedly in this series. Red Garland, Moodsville number 1. And the first 10 albums have this type of a cover, which can get confusing as to which ones you have and don't. So it's best to do the little print offs as I've talked about and have your little book of prints with you so you know, okay, I have that one, I don't have this one. Of course, you can do some of that online, but I often find a lot of record stores are hard to get phone service in to Google stuff. Red Garland Trio with Eddie Lockjaw Davis on some tracks. It's just beautiful. Beautiful melancholy. I'm a huge Red Garland fan. If you're kind of a beginner to jazz, Red Garland's a member of the first great Miles Davis quintet. He's the pianist behind that great group, along with Philly Joe Jones and Paul Chambers. They round up that rhythm section behind Coltrane and Miles. And Garland, to me, is a delight. He has dozens of records as well as a leader in the 7000 series at Prestige, but he gets a number of Moodsville titles as well. And the versions of these songs, Sam Jones on the bass, Art Taylor's on the drums. I love anything Red Garland Trio, just across the board. And this is what we're listening to right now is this Red Garland Moodsville number 1. I think this is probably 1958, 59. Let's see, there's a date on here. No date. But they start the sequence, I think, in the late 50s, and it runs into the early 60s. So let's move on. Moodsville number 2 is this fantastic Modern Moods, which is actually a collection as well. This is Miles Davis, Sonny Rollins, Modern Jazz Quartet, Sonny Stitt, John Coltrane, Art Farmer, and Donald Byrd. They all have a track on here. I'm guessing a couple of them, like the Miles and the Coltrane, are probably together. But you bill them separately to get that extra header on there. No, it looks like they got separate tracks. Again, beautiful ballads. Definitely worth seeking that out. Moodsville number 3. More Red Garland, Red Alone. And if I remember, it's just him doing solo work. It's just him on the piano playing beautiful, intricate, delicate balladry. Fantastic stuff. Moodsville number 3. And you can see you're in the record store. It can be pretty easy to be like, do I have that one? I don't remember. Moodsville number 4 is featuring Eddie Lockjaw Davis, big fan of, and with Shirley Scott, the great organ player. This one's got masking tape on it. Sadly, they have these green labels pretty much across the board. You can find these Moodsville records for as little as $10. You know, some sellers don't value them. Some stores don't think they're very collectible. You put $40 on it, it might sit there for 6 months. You put $15 on it, someone's gonna nibble. And let me just tell you now, you see a Moodsville title, you won't regret buying it. Even you avant-garde people, you guys who like all that crazy, sometimes you want to just simmer. You don't need to be boiling the pot all the time. You can't cook everything on high heat. Sometimes you gotta turn that heat down and let it just soak in its own juice. Put the kitchen to work. Number 5, Shirley Scott. And again, she has a long string of records here at Prestige and then at Impulse, where she does some great organ jazz, soul jazz, a lot with Stanley Turnkey, a lot with Lockjaw Davis. She's a fierce lady. And in a man's world, she makes 30, 40 records, which is an impressive feat in and of itself. And the girl can really swing. She's got a lot of soul and guts in her. I think this one had an original different cover, so I think this is probably a second, sorry, that came on a sequence. Moodsville 6, Red Garland Trio, once again, I'll Never Stop Loving You, Blues for Anne, and if I remember, it's the same bass player and drummer. Let's just take a look. This is an OJC pressing. Paul Chambers is on the bass here with Art Taylor, with Sam Jones on the first one. And Sam Jones and Paul Chambers it's like they almost like called each other to cover each other's shifts. They're so interchangeable at this point at a lot of these labels. But again, outstanding stuff. And like I said, OJC had the sense to reissue a number of these titles, not all of them, which will allow those titles to show up fairly inexpensively. This one had a different cover that looked like the other ones. This is a second version of it, Moodsville 7, At Ease with Coleman Hawkins. And Coleman gets a lot of work in this series. This is probably his first one from what I can tell, from what I remember here. Coleman's, of course, the giant of the tenor sax. He puts the tenor sax on the map, the instrument that we most now associate with jazz. In the 20s and before was not an instrument that was very prevalent in the jazz sound. And there wasn't saxophone in a lot of the New Orleans tradition. And it was a guy like Coleman Hawkins coming up with Fletcher Henderson that really brought what Armstrong developed on the trumpet to the saxophone, and eventually brings the saxophone to become the preeminent instrument in jazz in a lot of ways. So much to the point now where the average white guy hears saxophone on a Steely Dan record and thinks this is jazz. It doesn't work that way, guys. You can't just put a saxophone on something and make it jazz. But that's how much the saxophone has taken over the jazz landscape. This is the great Frank West, number 8, Moodsville 8. This one's the one of the ones with the color scheme that you'll know right away you don't have. That green and yellow sets it apart from all the other blues and purples that were going on there. Frank West played with Count Basie for a long time. A great arranger, an incredible player. He's as comfortable on the flute as he is on the saxophone. He plays a lot of things really well. A great, solid emoter. The band on this is really solid, if I remember. Looks like this is a promo copy. It was with Tommy Flanagan, Eddie Jones, and Bobby Donaldson. Donaldson has a record on Savoy that's pretty hard to come by. Again, outstanding stuff. Moodsville number 8. Moodsville number 9 is Tommy Flanagan trio number 9. Again, back to the purples and the pinks and the blues. And this is with Tommy Potter on the bass and Roy Haynes on the drums. Again, if you can't sit down and listen to some Red Garland or some Tommy Flanagan and just enjoy that, I'm not really sure why you think you love jazz. This is jazz that's accessible, and your wife actually might thank you. She might be like, okay, I actually like this. You know, I mean, why can't you listen to jazz like this more often? If I'm going to go in a car and my wife wants to take a little nap in the car, I'll play this kind of stuff. Some Bill Evans, some Tommy Flanagan. That's the kind of stuff that she'll be able to just nap to and not be bombarded by the brightness of a bunch of horns and a bunch of screeching craziness. This is Moodsville number 10, and they finally changed the covers here and go to a different kind of look. This is Red Garland again, Alone with the Blues. This one's pretty tough to come by. A lot of the other ones you see at the stores, you see them. I remember the first time I saw this one, I knew I'd never seen that before. So that's a pretty tough Moodsville to find. 1 second here. Moodsville 11, the great Lem Winchester. He was a cop, a lifelong cop that played music as a hobby and ended up getting noticed. He plays at Newport with some cats. I think Sonny Rollins even. He's a serious player. The guy can really play, and he does a record with. Sorry, tip of my mind. Already Argo with Ramsey Lewis. That trio, he sits in with them, and it's fantastic. And then he ends up getting a few records at Prestige, a couple in the New Jazz sequence, which are rare and hard to find and expensive. You can find this one in Moodsville from the same time, from the same contract, but because it's on Moodsville, you can find this one for $25-30, whereas the New Jazz titles will probably cost you closer to $100. That New Jazz logo has some cachet to it. Really rare stuff. Number 12 is the great Al Casey. I'm a big fan of jazz guitar. It's one of the most accessible, familiar sounds to white rock and roll fans. You can cross over into jazz guitar and still have the familiarity of the melody and the chords that the guitar brings to the table. And I find jazz guitar most of the time is very accessible, very enjoyable. Casey was a player with Fats Waller back in the 30s and 40s. And Fats is one of the great characters of early jazz, kind of a boogie-woogie piano, Harlem stride guy with a ton of personality, reminiscent of a Sidney Bechet in terms of how much color and personality they inflect on everything they play. There's a cheekiness to Fats Waller that changes the sound of everything he has to say. The greatest jazz players have a way of inflecting themselves in everything that they play. Whether it's a Louis Armstrong, whether it's a Billie Holiday, whether it's a guy, one second, got a bit of a sniffle right now, the allergy season is going on. Whether it's a guy like Fats Waller or Sidney Bechet, those greats, everything they play, their version of it becomes their material in a way. They can reinvent the stuff and inflect their own personality to it so strongly that a Billie Holiday version of a song might have very little to do with what the original composition was about. Charlie Parker was able to do that. Coltrane was one of the guys that Monk. Of course, Monk was much more resilient and much more reliant on his own composition, you know. But Al Casey, of course, played with Waller for a good 15 years and was bringing color and sound, and he's really a forgotten figure today. And this is with Lee Anderson, Jimmy Lewis, and Belton Evans on the drums. Al Casey, again, he was one of the guys I knew last in this sequence. I didn't really know who he was, but this one and the one he does in the Swingville sequence are both outstanding. Just a great player, and these were the first records he did as a leader. So again, Bob Weinstock, thank you. And he makes a few more records, I think, for Black and Blue over in England, I think in the 70s. But really, his primary work from this era, Weinstock's responsible for recording them. This is the great Oliver Nelson, again with Lem Winchester on it. And Oliver Nelson, of course, in the late 50s, was a great sax player. He was a great, fiery player who had a lot of edges to him, dabbles with the avant-garde and some of those sounds. And he ends up steering his own career more into composition and arrangement, and becomes one of the primary arrangers for Impulse Records. He's arranging stuff at Verve for Creed Taylor. I think you end up seeing him even arranging stuff at CTI later, if I remember, and getting into Hollywood and television. Oliver Nelson was a clever, brilliant player and arranger. Here you hear him playing ballads with Lem Winchester and Nocturne, Man with the Horn, In a Sentimental Mood. Wonderful stuff. And again, not something you should ignore. This is fantastic material. M14, Arnett Cobb. Cobb is in the school of the Gene Ammons, bit like Dexter Gordon, Texas Tenorman. So he's got some of the Illinois Jack Cat sound going on. Tall drink of water, a guy that was ferocious and just played so from his gut. And there's footage of him as an old guy being helped on the stage, and he looked like he was about to fall apart. Then he put that horn to his mouth, and he was a tornado. You got to be so impressed by some of these old black men and the life that they dedicated to this music and how much they gave of themselves to their very last breath in a lot of cases. More Coleman Hawkins, M15, The Hawk Relaxes. And At Ease, which I showed you earlier, and this were two of my first Coleman Hawkins records. And At Dawning. These are the type of songs that I think as jazz fans we seek and wish to find, but they're not as easy to get to and find as we think, because there's so much misinformation out there that we end up sitting there and listening to Eric Dolphy going, this is great, isn't it? And it is great, but there's so much more to jazz than just that unease. And I think more of us want the comforting sounds of jazz. We just aren't knowing where to find it, because the jazz vinyl community is so stuck in money and being hip and being cool and look at me. You know, no one wants to say, look at Billy Taylor on Moodsville, look at me, how cool am I? It's always about, look at the $400 record I found that sold 6 copies when it was released. Just a pet peeve of mine. This is Moodsville number 16, Billy Taylor. Billy Taylor is one of the great educators. He taught the public. He had public access TV shows on NBC. He did a lot of the late night shows. Billy Taylor was always kind of an ambassador, helping spread the gospel of jazz and the blues. And he's a very versatile player, so much to the point where it's almost hard to define Billy Taylor's style, because he can do a lot of things. And he can play in a lot of different tones and genres all really well. And it kind of means he doesn't really have a sound of his own in some ways. But Billy's a great player. His work at Riverside, I'm a big fan of. Stuff on ABC is fantastic. This is fantastic, Billy Taylor. I love Billy, and I think he's someone that more people should check out, because you can find Billy Taylor records for $5. This is the great Willis Jackson, In My Solitude. Another one that took me a long time to track down. Willis is one of those kind of soul jazz proponents in the early to mid 60s at Prestige, along with Gene Ammons and Lockjaw Davis. He's one of the real cats pushing the sounds of soulful, gospel-inflected, blues-drenched playing. And Willis Jackson's as good as that as anybody out there. That's number 17. Number 18 is Gene Ammons, speaking of. And Gene, of course, has a long sequence of great records at Prestige, starting early in the 7000 sequence, going into the 74, 7500s. There's got to be 20, 25 titles that Gene Ammons has his name on as a leader. His early all-star groups were fantastic conglomerations. A lot of the who's who of jazz, including guys like Coltrane, show up in those groups. Again, he was kind of just cherry-picking the talent at Prestige and putting together these great records. Jug spent some time in prison, sadly, for drugs, and he came back in the late 60s, I believe, early 70s, and made some more great music. But anything Gene Ammons from the 50s to like 62 is great stuff. His Bossa Nova record at Prestige is fantastic. His stuff here on Moodsville is definitely noteworthy. Number 19, now we're talking, this is Shirley Scott. There she is, a diminutive little gal who plays 4 times her size. She plays with a fierceness and an edge that's really hard to measure. She's so much more of a player than you anticipate her being. And then number 20, Clark Terry. And Terry's a fantastic player out of St. Louis. He's a very bright player with a lot of yellows and oranges in his tone, really joyful. He seems to always have a big smile on his face, and it comes across in his playing. Again, personality helps us define who these guys are and what they sound like. And Terry's just that guy. Whether he's recording at Argo, Mercury, or whether he's working with Ellington, or whether he's doing his stuff at Impulse. Here he is in the ballad setting, of course, at Moodsville, and you hear Terry, just how wonderful a player Clark Terry is. Moving along, Taft Jordan, another fantastic trumpet player from the swing era who became very much a forgotten guy. He played with Chick Webb, and then when Ella Fitzgerald takes over that group, because Chick's passing, it becomes Ella's group. He stays on with that group for quite a long time. In the 40s, he plays with Duke Ellington. He actually plays on Miles Davis' Sketches of Spain, Taft Jordan. Really beautiful player, again with different edges. Taft can be quite brilliant and sharp and colorful, but he can also be filled with blues and lavenders and softer tones, which of course he is on that record. Really beautiful record. You can find that for $10. Outstanding. Yusef Lateef, Eastern Sounds. This is actually 7319 from the Prestige sequence, but this was also Moodsville 22. I think it has the same cover, even if I remember. And so I actually keep this in the 7300 sequence, but it's also here in the Moodsville sequence. Yusef's part of that great Detroit players school of thought. He had a lot of world sound in him, and he brings a lot of different sounds to the table in the late 50s on his Savoy recordings. He comes to Prestige, and here he's playing, of course, Middle Eastern kind of tones and some ballad setting. This one's not as just ballads as some of these records are, but it's gorgeous stuff. And Yusef always has a depth to him that's always fun to swim in. Here's Coleman Hawkinson doing good old Broadway, Moodsville 23, playing songs from the Broadway shows. And the great Coleman Hawkins should never be overlooked. You see Coleman Hawkins, especially for under $20, you should always buy that. Sam the Man Taylor. This guy is a victim of the labels he played on. He's a great player, filled with souls, filled with the blues. I love his version of Harlem Nocturne. It's just fantastic, noir, spy thriller sounding stuff. He plays at MGM for a long time, which affected how he sounded, what he had to record. He plays some pretty light in nature stuff that's still very enjoyable. Don't get me wrong, but MGM's not going to let you be the black blues gospel player as much as a label like Bob Weinstock will. So to hear him in this setting is real revelation. He ends up in Japan, where he became a star in the 70s. They love Sam the Man Taylor, and you should love Sam the Man Taylor as well. More Coleman Hawkins, Moodsville 25, No Strings, more Broadway stuff. Clark Terry plays the jazz version of All American with Oliver Nelson's oversight of arrangements. A little Reed Miles influence on the cover there, obviously, but not done as well. This is the solid trumpet of Cody Williams, and Cody was one of the great trumpet players of the swing era. He plays with Ellington for a long time as well. Also played with Fletcher Henderson and Chick Webb, just like Taft Jordan does. Plays with Duke at the Cotton Club for like 15 years. He's a part of that band. And when he left, he created a little bit of a controversy. He joined Benny Goodman for a while. And then he creates his own band. And in that band, he had greats like Charlie Parker and Bud Powell. And there was another name here that was impressive as well. Lacha also played with him in that group. And he kind of falls into obscurity like a lot of those swing guys did. And again, Bob Weinstock says, Cody, come record for me. And so this is one of the few recordings he gets from this era. And he's just a giant of a player. This is the Soulful Moods of Gene Ammons, a record I passed over a long time because I never liked the cover that much. And then I realized it was a Moodsville M28. And so I grabbed it, and it's really a wonderful record. But Gene Ammons' Jug always plays with guts. Probably the most expensive Moodsville is this Kenny Burrell with Coleman Hawkins Bossa Nova record from like 61, 62. Great cover, great record, tough to find. This record can approach $100 easily, and it's beautiful, beautiful, and atmospheric Kenny Burrell, which I'm always a big fan of. Eddie Lockjaw Davis with Shirley Scott, Moodsville number 30. Great cover, fantastic playing on this. You got Wendell Marshall on the bass, George Duvivier, Arthur Edgehill, and Ray Barretto on conga. We talked about Ray Barretto the other day. This is fascinating, fantastic stuff. Moodsville number, I think, 31 now. More Coleman Hawkins plays Makes Someone Happy from Do Re Mi. More Coleman doing Broadway stuff. All of this stuff is fantastic. This is Miles Davis and John Coltrane playing Richard Rodgers, M32. And again, this is one of those collections I told you about. They take pieces from different Miles and Coltrane records. I think one's from when they're playing. Actually, this might all be from the Cooking, Working, Steam, and Relaxing. I think this is all from Working, Steam, and Cooking, Relaxing. It's the ballads from those records put together. Fantastic stuff. Number M36. This is Dave Pike. Plays the jazz version of Oliver. Not a big fan of that cover, but it's a great record. Again, Into the Moodsville is worth having. Number 38, The Broadway Scene, played by America's Greatest Jazzmen. Again, it's a collection of different stuff. And then number 39, Lucky Thompson plays Jerome Kern and No More. That's a wonderful piece. And this one's not the collection that these other late ones have been. I'm missing a few of those collections in the 30s, but this is the last Moodsville 39 from what I remember. And there's only a few of those collections that I'm missing there in the late 30s. That's pretty much the entire Moodsville set. And it's just great stuff. Don't pass them up when you get the chance to buy them, because they're getting tougher to find. I'll even tell you this. Some of these old Moodsville records, if they're old pressings, they can look a little scuffy, but will play just fine. They really will. And even though they're kind of ballad and softer sounds, there might be a little fire crackle on some of that stuff. But if you can get an old Moodsville for $6 because it's got a few lines on the top, buy that. That warm, fat crackle of the fire will help warm you. Jazz doesn't need to be always this pristine, listen through the looking glass. Sometimes it needs to come through the crackle of an old Victrola or an old American Armed Forces radio, RCA, those big standing consoles with the crackle of the static. That's how jazz was played for so long and how people heard it for so long. We shouldn't always be so afraid. We don't want records that skip. We don't want records that the needle jumps around. But if it's just got a little bit of crackle in it, it's not going to hurt you. And in fact, it's going to remind you that this comes from the Waltons age. This comes from the age before television. This comes from the age when there was no NBA. The NFL was a shadow of itself. The hockey was the original 6 teams and that's it, just a regional sport. Baseball ruled the landscape. People read their papers every day to get their box scores from the St. Louis Browns playing against the New York Highlanders, which became the Yankees. The Washington Senators playing against the Cleveland Indians. Baseball was very powerful as a medium in that interwar period. And so jazz is from that era. And you listen to the crackle of an old baseball game from the Yankees playing the Cardinals or the Pirates. There's a little bit of Mazeroski crackle going on. We shouldn't be so afraid of that. And there's only going to be so many pristine, near mint copies of these records out there. And you don't need to always pay $30 for some expensive reissue. Don't worry about it. Don't care what your friends say. If you don't enjoy that, that's fine. But I think for the most part, it's not going to hurt anybody. So I'm going to wrap that episode up today. Thank you again, Patreon supporters. If you want some great jazz merchandise, Jazz Shepherd merch, head to the store in the credits below. And also check out the podcast. The new episode went up today. I think there's 10 episodes up now in total. If you guys want that for walking around, y'all be safe. Have a great day. Peace.